Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first rounds of Spars for the Debate Boutique 10-day college program. I'm so excited to have two of our first debaters here for this. I apologize for my camera being off. My internet's really bad, but I'm very excited to be back with you all. And with that being said, we can have the AF begin if you want to introduce what your AF was, and then we'll get started.
My AF was a logistics AF by using Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's literature. The advocacy was the undercommons and sort of logistical sabotage. And
Probably realized we should introduce the negative argument as well before we start with the 2AC. Yeah. So Jazmyn, after you.
The 1NC was an A-spec argument about how chaos needs to specify their actors, and then it was like a set call, like Academy K research style argument with a few just presumption case arguments.
Awesome. All right. Whenever the 2AC is ready to begin, if you want to send it, probably just in the chat, that'd probably be the easiest, and then we'll go from there.
Sorry, keep saying network disconnect. Can we just use the Discord?
Yeah, that works too.
All right, should be sent. Is everybody ready?
I'm good whenever.
Jazmyn? Yeah. The answer to the prior question should frame your evaluation of the ballot. The first vessel produced by legislation was not the slave ship, but the body itself. The colonization and brutality inflicted on flesh is created an homicidal fantasy that we must repeat in order to fulfill drive for constant improvement under the science of loss prevention. Antitrust is a form of racial cap wherein the resolution, positioning of politics and investment, and anti-sociality means either merging or breaking up entities in a way that requires us to accept the ontological status of prescribed prosperity that results in the eradication of flesh and land. The one I see is the destruction of the debate space whose external and internal impact should become the burden and rejoinder of the negative investment that need to drive the ballot instead of pursue the scholarship. The one I see presents a total overhaul. Racialization of the earth reduces land to production, makes necessary the elimination of biodiversity, prompting a cycle of endless destruction. We can only solve through anti-competitive disassembly away from the topic. Debate is labor that amalgamizes being into the rhythm of the settler. The rhythm of this world, and its beat means that nothing can be heard and nothing can be felt. To conform to this rhythm is to perform synaptic labor. To be individual is to be logistic. To settle into a rhythm that kills. The only response to this is openness. The one I see is a performance and refusal from the undercommons that results in coalition formation. We must work to breed community and singularity, to erode the dialectic politics of the scope, convert racialized deathscapes into home spaces, and remember the intergenerational complexity that set the conditions of possibility for being in the world. Our first argument is about defense on subjectivity. Our defense on subjectivity won't link to the Cape, but it probably does prove the A-spec violation. I'll get there in a second. But overall, this line of thinking that says the app can't stop exterior socialization misunderstands what Moten's project is doing. It is not that our counter-socialization removes all socialization, but it simply provides an alternative avenue for us to produce liminal spaces that exist, in which Moten's argument about how we can be in but not of things like the university, the commons, etc., etc. We will always have a relationship to larger society, but we don't have to cede all control to that society, which gives us a reasonable claim for solvency. Next argument is about blueprints. I'll impact term this. Blueprints for studying are bad. This mirrors the logic of the normative university structure mode and critiques, wherein pedagogical spaces become microcosms and the logistical war on difference, demanding our normalization, i.e. policing and patrolling the boundaries of proper academic knowledge. This article also makes no sense. What is the internal link between exporting a method and inviting others to engage in relationality? You don't invoke relationality through a singular method, but rather exploring new ways of being and knowing that exists independently of states' ways of knowing and being, which is a pretty easy solvency threshold to me, as all we have to win is that the app generates new knowledge and access. This, and lastly, the Brian Carden debate in the academy colonizes our politics. Oops, Moten already wrote an entire book about our relationship to the university. It's called The Undercommons. The exchange of ideas without a reference to the world is exactly what Moten critiques and moves forward by, in fact, refusing to have a specific telos, which is the type of literature Brian is criticizing, teleological literature. Moten explicitly says the field of the political is anti-black and as a result does not endorse political mobilization in the way the card suggests. Only the app allows a new way of existing in, but not of the university that reduces our parasitic investments in things like enlightenment, knowledge production, and the university imposition of the drive for productivity, A-spec framework. First, we meet, the agents are simply us. Two, no counterinterpret, just impact turning the attempt to force us to disclose specific agents of our plan. A, the point of the app is that we mobilize as many individuals as possible to move in, but not of the assembly line against the logistical flows of capital. The inability to put specific agents that actually have the solvency mechanism operates. We refuse to transparently disclose everyone who participates in the app because rather than we endorse the us finding communality within the Undercommons that works to breed community. A fugitive practice does not entail openly putting targets on our back, especially in a world where debate is open to the real world. This particular round being recorded proves my point that it would only allow the increased grafting and violence onto the undercommon body politic through transparency. Rather, vote after affirm opacity. B, coherent CDA, cross-apply mode, mapping us onto a coherent plan for non-critical debaters mirrors the desire to be taken seriously within the law, legitimize the slow procedures of excluding deviant knowledges and prevents the possibility to create new knowledge because it relies on overdetermined political scripts that can only see the world in reaction to the state and its of being. If we win an impact, you vote out because they create a violent relationship to unknown scholarships within the debate community. C, individuation. DA, by demanding we continually shape our discourse and politics around the specific individuals who do the advocacy rather than attempting to mobilize the collective against the undercommons, we come to only understand ourselves insofar as we can feel that we've served the community in the correct way, which is the exact orientation of individuation we're trying to overturn. They become individuals, agents of a hierarchical body politic that asks us to produce in the collective regardless of our inability or ability to produce, which is independently ableist due to different people being able to contribute differently that their interpret flattens. 3, impact defense. A, neg ground, no ground loss other than politics days. It's very easy to negate an app without knowing the agent's epistemological or ontological discussion of both things. The one I see takes a heavy stance on mode is a common debate theory of power, and knowing exactly who does the plan is not important if you can specify your neg links to the idea of people doing or being involved in advocacy without knowing which specific people there are. Every single disad to counter advocacy and critique, we can still generate links, so no ground loss. B, limits. We preserve limits through relation to the topic and needing a stable advocacy, just not agents. Our argues that we should be forced to adhere to their limits. It's not people of color in debate who screwed up the model of a deliberation that the debate relies on, but the static parameters surrounding us, which did that force us into certain positions. They only grab violence back onto whoever the agents of the debate are. 4, I'm going to impact turn predictability. It's bad, arbitrary, infinitely regressive, and slash better when you're forced to think on your feet because it prepares you for the real world where it is unpredictable and unfair. Slash inevitable. It's just a question of what sort of class you're having. Argues you have to generate yourself will always be better. 5, their impacts aren't terminal, just internal links to unfalsifiable impacts, i.e. fairness or education. Auto rejecting permutation arguments is asinine. The threshold for evaluating competition is not who does the advocacy and the neg, but rather are they combinable ways to look at the world. This is silly and they don't get access to it if they don't explicitly go for this argue the 2 and R&D, all the impact turns here. And all of these cross-apply onto the settler colonialism critique, specifically the individuation and coherence idea, because A, it presumes a specific coherent structure of understanding settler colonialism rather than a fluid one, and B, constituent element of colonialism critique. Perm do both the anti-competitive assembly line is obviously compatible with their alt of the pedagogy of the land because it involves some sort of relationship to the land that can be mediated through the permutation that fluctuates back and forth between the app and the alt. Cartographic coherence capacity. DA, indigenous subjectivity is secured through an ability to have a relation to space and time, which secures the distinction between black and indigenous peoples. Moten 13. What distinguishes the sovereign settler and even the savage from the slave is precisely that they share a capacity for space and time coherence practice for time routine, although at every scale their maps are radically compatible. The respective mapness is never in question. The capacity for cartographic coherence is the thing itself, which is their subjectivity for both the settler and the savage and articulates them to one another, and that network of connections transfers display and it constitutes ontological reach to the truth of formulations that I cannot have a meaning. The meaning origin to his or own given in the terminological failure of the interplay of blackness and nothingness is given in ongoing drama of force and entry. And 3, their decision to advocate for native side to sovereignty and spatiality, settlers created a policy debate space that relegates native people to phallic objects and native best and the desire for recognition on from settler who ignore their vague claims of material solvency for native Okinawan people's policy debate chaos are centered on combating colonialism and completely divorced from material gains and constitute a parasitic drive for the ballot like the all pro 17 data debate offering sovereignty as a solution to genocide relegates native people to phallic objects of the past whose future in the hands of settlers who bravely dare to talk about them. The terrain is a cleared landscape produced by anti-black labor. Material gains involve native labor from native people organizing at the grassroots level, not an academic labor from settlers. The struggle from sovereignty itself is not to overcome or solve genocide. Native debate has become so associated with words like land sovereignty, space, treaty rights, and others that it's impossible to theorize native debate. Absent sovereignty is a Marxism. Non-native debaters are attacking the same register with incredibly limited slippage towards genocide. As a vector of violence, debate arguments do not and cannot facilitate the material elements of decolonization that these land based arguments frequently rely on. Perceptually, native arguments include a discussion of sovereignty and spatiality. What other reason could this be than the structure of desire around that recognition of the settler master? If we really follow the history of how nativeness has been misrepresented in the debate by settlers, it becomes clear that much of contemporary native debate, strangely, or as argued, not so strange, mimics these representations. 4, linked turn, obviously the limits out the capacity for productivity imposed onto the land, which is what Bowen specifically talks about in the second part as being the internal link to why land is expropriated and why accumulation and dispossession has, and why we use land for specific teleological ends that service white supremacy and colonialism. Obviously, the AF would solve that by rethinking our individual relationship to the environment and each other. 5, the paradigm of colonization is not sufficient to encompass the genocidal modality of global anti-blackness, this aspirational humanity of indigenous positions that a clientele of civil society, while the grammar of sovereignty relegates blackness to the unthought. This is a violent grammar erasure, sure that only recreates humanism would 7. Violence necessary to the extraction of resources means death is a daily feature of shared experience in the realm of the social powers and not necessarily indexical of a shared position in the realm of the structure. While Black Africans and Indigenous Americans may be both exploited by the relations of capital, they do not perform the same usefulness in the structure of humanity. I turn to Fanon conceptual framework to bear on this. Indigenous Americans were incorporated in a world already formed to anti-Black and Europe, but become longer familiarized with Blacks by the time they countered the indigenous people of the Americas. Discourse on humanity is revealing, Indian is revealing when read in terms of violent justice position with Africans. Like, what is the Indian Spanish father? No such pause in relation to Africans, Bolas, Casas, and Sabolo that were engaged in hated debate whether the African slaves stood by rather than having already been extensively enslaved. The position of the offer the condition of possibility for European ethnics like Casa was himself and over several African slaves of Casa proposed the introduction of the African slaves to Caribbean islands, the mechanism of sparing means heavy labor, destroying them. He never crusaded in the mystery of African. If you cannot be white, so you do not be Black. Indians of America was subjected to genocide, and this genocide signifies an antagonism compared to the position of slave because genocide reconditioned empirical reality. The presence of the Black hour means to distinguish something about sovereignty and genocide. Yeah, mark the card right after sovereignty and genocide, last paragraph of the words.
Okay, ready for cross?
Yeah, I'm ready for cross.
Okay, are there any reasons to reject the team?
Reasons to reject the team? No.
Okay, nice. I'm gonna go to the K page now. What was the warrant for the link turn about limiting out productivity?
Oh, it's the imposition of productivity onto land that creates the possibility for colonial accumulation and dispossession, rethinking not only our individual relationship to each other, but also like things like the land that we are present on, which the undercommons would do, obviously disrupts the rhythm of the settler. It's just a cross application of the
Okay,
overview.
what will you defend as the new relationality created by the AF?
It's not a specific relationality created by the AF, but relationality that is not A, humanist, and B, not an imposition of productivity onto the individual in relation to the productive collective.
Okay, can you explain the value that has in debate?
The value that has in debate, I mean, sure, lots of debaters are often like forced to give their labor in order to like achieve a wins-losses paradigm. We obviously think that that imposition of labor that we are measured in relation to the collective at tournaments is something that allows for violence.
I get that you think that that's bad, but what does the 1AC's relationality do to deconstruct the labor that happens in those situations?
Well, I mean, it allows for a renegotiation of the labor because rethinking the way that the individual relates to the collective means that we as individuals are able to renegotiate, rethink, and re-examine.
Okay, on the ASPEC flow, you said that the participants in the AF was like just you. I guess who else participated?
No, sorry. We, when I said we, it's we in the undercommons. So everybody who would identify as part of the undercommons.
Okay.
And participate.
I guess I'll go to the Woods evidence. What will you defend as the definition of global anti-Blackness?
global anti-blackness is simply, simply put, the world's requirement upon anti-black violence.
Okay,
violence.
what is anti-blackness's relationship to settler colonialism as prescribed its evidence?
Okay, yeah, that settler colonialism, it's very ethical compartmentalization of this is what we should do with the land. This is why colonization is justified, relies upon an ethic that is only comes into world through anti-blackness.
What's the warrant for that?
Why
is that only because of anti-blackness?
Well,
first, you made an argument about productivity being the cause of colonization. The Woods argument that you just made is in relationship to anti-blackness. I guess what's the warrant for that being the root cause?
But it's a humanism argument, right? When he says, well, Black Africans and Indigenous Americans may be both exploited by the relations of capital, they do not perform the same usefulness in the structure of humanity. Anti-blackness is integral to the human, and that humanism and its displacement onto Indigenous people is why colonialism happened.
Okay, that's time. I have 5 minutes of prep. I'll start it now. Okay, I'll stop prep at 2:42. I'm gonna put that in the chat so I can keep track of it. Okay, and then the order is just gonna be the K page.
Awesome. Are you sending out a doc or anything?
I was not going to because there aren't any cards.
Perfect. I am good to begin whenever everyone else is.
Okay, Afridy,
One sec, sorry.
you're good.
Flow. Good.
Okay, nice. The KOA's insurance case colonial balance is no longer just the clearing of land, but the clearing of all spaces, and white academia continually acts as a benevolent actor capable of reforming itself. Whiteness has become the central way domination and dispossession, which actualizes itself into material forms of genocide and violence. Our impacts and the primal drive within settlers to seek land and produce dispossession and necessitates ongoing clearing. The reach of colonialism is endless, and every within modernity outweighs on magnitude and probability. But this continued genocide's time frames to both past and future, absent of politics capable of disrupting it, only refusal of reinvestments within the system can threaten its stability because coloniality is dependent on continued participation in its politics. I'm going to do the framework debate here. The 2AC doesn't make an interpretation, so you should default to ours. Evaluate the 1AC as a project of research. First is that speech don't materialize into the practice of activity, nor the actualization of the undercommons. The voting affirmative doesn't mean that you endorse our study out of this round. So the only outcome of this debate is whether or not the 1AC was good or not. Second is because they don't have a stable advocacy, you should default to our interpretation. That's a key to clash, because otherwise we have nothing to generate links off of, because we don't know if they'll defend the material consequences or who participates in the 1AC or who is in the undercommons. So we should get to critique both the form and content of their model and research project. Our Patel evidence at the stake debate functionally conceded the possession of land has been transferred to the ownership of knowledge. Answers all of their arguments about individuation specifically to the land, because whiteness is the only thing accepted in academia absorbs indigenous narratives to reproduce a logical nation within spaces like debate that the securitized self-preserving strategies against indigenous resistance. You should question what restoring faith in debate by sparking a new political change can ever do for indigenous people given their structural position via the ontology debate frame. This debate through the lens of our rift can cover the 2AC concedes it's a settler subject formation decide and a research link. You shouldn't validate their calls for the affirmative on stolen land as a settler move to innocence that reproduces displacement of indigenous people, renders them an afterthought. The subject formation of the 1AC only serves to construct settlers as oppressed under the system of logistics that they can act benevolent actors who can participate in the undercommons. Mean that the link debate comes prior to weighing the ontology debate goes conceded first that the ontology debate is a decide and a new link to the affirmative. They misidentified and theorized the way that violence happened. The 1% risk of the app being better, ontology being true means the app only further securitizes settlers world ordering. Even if I went ontology, and that's sufficient enough to vote negative presumption because ontology is an impact of the research part of the 1AC produces portable skills in education that adhere to settled futurity. First is inhabited settled necessitates the inhabitants of indigenous land post initial colonization makes it sink as a project of homemaking. Every interaction initial post colonization is structured by colonialism. The impact secures the settled drive for genocide and dehumanization, which operates symbolically and materially upon the initial displacement. The U.S. had to securitize itself against alternative to a political orientation. Indigenous people on American core value of the U.S. is to eliminate the native indigenous people are not implicated in the drive for power that the settled states attempt to securitize itself against. Second is a logical nation filtered through inhabitants. They've conceded the warrants to the Rift primal drive within settled to seek land and produce dispossession. The question is sovereignty enables whiteness to operationalize sovereignty because of the right to possession, the distinction between who is and who isn't civilized, which allows violence to be justified against certain population, which answers their offense here. But I'm going to do the morphing debate here. Settled is a fluid structure. They answer their evidence about fluidity because it morphs and takes different forms to conceal self-promoting a narrative of democracy. Violence is shifted from straight mutilation to visible and invisible genocide, like the missing and murdered indigenous women crisis, poverty, exclusion from democracy, and erasure from the frontier. I'm grouping the Woods cartographic coherence data arguments here. We don't need to win a root cause argument, but we have one the proximate cause, but their theory neglects the nuances and intersectionality of blackness in relationship to indigeneity. The master who struggles with the slave is the same colonizer who clears the land, but I'm going to turn their arguments about relationality here because communicating through a form of logisticality cannot mitigate or erase the ontological violence that we've explained, nor the violence that they prescribe, but it becomes a project of enduring violence instead of breaking these conditions of violence down. I'm going to do the link debate here. I'm going for the Palmerston Universities, like the Athens on a decolonial strategy, critical theory in academia, mistakes, pedagogies of self-actualization. The app uses critical theory in spaces like debate with zero tells. Once we hang up in the Zoom call, none of us engage in things like the 1AC future study unless we're already doing so, but the app doesn't change the relationship to the systems around, nor preclude the possibility for decolonial transformation. This is a turn to the app scholarship. The app is not a new university where they're quote in but not of, but it replaces settled forms of knowledge with their form of study. It's merely a second one that obscures bounds imposed by settled knowledge as a tool facilitating and justifying genocide elimination by producing a settler pseudo study. They've missed the jump here. They indict whiteness while actively participating in the same logics of whiteness. They haven't won an internal link to any of their debate offense about how they're able to change and ignored, but this outweighs the opposite imagine a utopia in which settlers radically imagine that all personal knowledge is special. That's a 2AC cross-application of their individuation decided results in the manifestation, the devaluation of all knowledges, but specifically indigenous one, which is an affirmation of the deterritorialization of indigenous knowledge and seeks to limit out voices that potentially challenge the existence of the nation. They vote negative on presumption. The key warrant and unique question of the Palmerston is the fact that scholarship can never repatriate land or liberate students, but instead it uses settled technologies to uphold the university and only manifests itself in the reinvestments and debates, repetition, compulsion by their calls for the valve. But our impact outweighs, it destroys material organizing capacity. The app produces worse radicals who advocate for transfer of power with no way to actualize the methodology or destroying the system.
that they are indicting. They feel satisfied at the end of the day without having to produce any sorts of changes, because they've indebted the way that labor and debate happens without having a methodology in order to solve that. It disincentivizes people who experience the 1AC from going out and taking material action, because they've already participated in the 1AC's new form of study, which also gets the ability for the act to produce any transition to power. Turns case done into a nostalgia link here. The accumulation of knowledge as power can never disavow settlers or state structure, and then itself reconciles into nostalgia that their mountain and hardy evidence is futurist imagination of a permanent world in which white academia has never toppled. Settlers are always nostalgic for the current power, thinking about how they can, quote, recognize what can never be stolen as the power to give everything away, and idealizing about a world in which that power may be challenged, knowing that the day will never come because of their own control of knowledge. 2AC on the aspect flow says that the advocate is just them, but where's the answer to the question about what does the AF do to create a new form of study when it's just the people who participate in the undercommons or them? It doesn't result in the materiality or actualization of it, but the impact of settlerism. This not only distances settlers from their own bounds, but it creates a position of forced empathy in which indigenous people need to feel bad for settlers being because of their fears of demise on their own empire, and it delegitimizes the nature of genocide and gaslights indigenous peoples, telling to the bounds of going for the politics of recognition. Link is going to answer the link turn below, but it destroys their politics, the desire to be recognized by the university and academy and academia, while receiving the praise for their critique of logistics and proposal of fugitivity, precludes the possibility for solving the affirmative. This theorization of the academy is a tool of the settler state to reproduce death through the logical nation. That the Palperson uniqueness argument from above, it reifies all their impact and method. It conveys into parodying discourses of recognition that forces them to become complicit in their own marginalization. The university is an apparatus of colonization which will collapse and commodify their politics, but the modern university cannot be transformed through more inclusion. It turns any undercommons offense that the one ear tries to sit down on. That's our Patel evidence. We're going to cross-apply the Bryant card from the case page. They've missed the jump here. We're making an argument about the way that the academy is structured, not the way that material balance function, though we already did that work on a theory of power, but this mitigates all of your offense about solvency, specifically in debate, in the way that labor functions happen within debate rounds, because debate uniquely colonizing the conclusion is the academy can only function through the commodity of intellectual labor. It turns case because theory is not capable of intervening in the political debate, specifically funnels it into the university system that makes it an exchange of idea without any way to actualize any sort of change outside of the space. Gonna do the alternative debate here. The only argument that and they make against it that we're not able to create a relationality, but the link debate is specific to how these sort of relationalities cannot be actualized within the alternative is a prior question. Subtle colonialism exists through utilizing multiple tools of genocide. Education has become a support system for producing benevolent narratives of the U.S. empire. Vote negative to endorse the deterritorialization of indigenous knowledge, to reclaim educational land, and reform the relationship to education and educational model. The modern university that the affirmative seeks to produce study in is irredeemable. We control the internal link to their offense. Education has become a privilege protected by colonialism. Thus, the first step to disrupt this primary tool advanced the refusals of colonial subjectivity and desire for inclusion within the academy. This refusal of scholarship practices like the affirmative uniquely key, given the way that colonialism constantly morphs, only refusing epistemology that can uphold the system, that can destabilize the system, is able to bring it down, would mean that we don't need a win, that we're able to create some sort of new subjectivity. We've already made an inherent argument specifically within the Bollinger evidence for why indigenous narratives and discourses are specifically good to talk about. Not that we should inject these into the academy, but that we should depend on them for educational practices and refuse one that reinvests in settlerism. I'm gonna do the permutation debate here. No permutations. We are winning a better method of engagement with the academy, so you should vote negative. They've already refused to defend a stable advocacy, so letting them permute defends her guts all negative ground. But even if you buy the 2AC arguments about colonization under a system of logistics, at 2AC3, we made an argument and critique about the way that they've chosen to respond to this found specifically within the university. But framework answer the permutation. We critique the research project, the 1AC, their academic engagement, and their mechanism which can prior to evaluating the 1AC versus the alternative. But permutation becomes intrinsic to severance because it had analysis, the asked ontological assumptions that weren't in the 1AC to reintroduce them, because it makes them a moving target and allows for abstractionness, meaning that we can never be prepared to debate them. And I'm gonna go for a settler innocence to have the permutation attempts to relieve settler feelings of guilt without giving up land of privilege, which allows for settler recuperation. Opposite the alternative, settlers never be subject to discomfort of the reality and action without, or the reality of their actions, which prevents them from ever being able to solve. Ready for cross.
First framework argument says that the AF is only a project of research.
Yeah.
What does that entail? What was the burden of the neg then?
The burden of the negative is to disprove that research project or promote a better one, which we've defended as the alternative.
So is the also a research project, or does it do material action?
We've made an argument on the link debate about how subjectivities in debate cannot actualize into material change, but we made a prerequisite argument about refusing bad epistemologies.
We don't think that that means that like decolonization happens or anything as a result of it, just that we need to refuse these things because refusing subtle colonial subjectivities is key to destabilizing the system.
Okay, that makes sense. Why are we a new university that creates knowledge, I guess? Like, how do
okay.
we-
Our argument on the Paperson link was not that you're a new university, but that you're the exact same university that we critiqued while thinking that it's like special and woke or whatever. Like the AF is not in, but not of the
What's the
university.
bright
We're saying
line?
that you are the university.
What's the bright line for deviating from Enlightenment knowledges? Like, at what point would you admit that we would be a hypothetically new university, or not a university?
I guess,
Like,
can
what
you
do we have
rephrase
to
your
do?
question? I'm not sure what
What
you're
do we have to
asking.
do? What would we have to do as an epistemic project to not be the recreation of the university?
I guess I don't think that's the burden of the negative to prove, but we've made an argument about
Well,
the
if it's
way
not the
that
birth, then
debaters.
how does the alt do it? Because you've said that the alt is also some sort of knowledge project. So how does the alt do it then?
Oh, okay. So I guess more on the alternative debate, we think that the affirmative's value of critical theory within academia being able to actualize into us creating this new relationality and we're all like fugitives and stuff is bad because critical theory within the academy specifically mistakes pedagogies as self-actualization. Like these things don't actually materialize into things outside of this space. It's just an imaginary utopia in which we talk about these forms of violence and we think that we're doing things, but we're really not. We've made an argument about refusal, not creating new pedagogies, because we think that these pedagogies of the land already exist within indigenous communities.
Gotcha. Okay. Last thing, answers to the perm were simply 1, intrinsic severance thing, 2, framework means no perm, 3, settler innocence, and 4, something about like us refusing to defend a stable advocacy means no perm. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then there was just like no permanent method debate arguments.
Yeah, no perm and method debate.
Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty much time. I'm just gonna start prep now. In prep, 2 minutes left. No cards. It's just going to be, well, actually, it's going to be case framework than the K.
Oh, by framework, do you mean like that A-spec page?
Yeah. Okay. Everybody good?
Yep.
They've considered our thesis that logistics as a system of anti-black capitalism through globalized market supply chains and the shipping of objects around the world. That frames your flow. Everything's only possible as a result of logistical subjugation. We're all complicit in a system that maintains its legitimacy by forcing individuals to access productivity through American exceptionalist globalist narratives. The first impact is settlerism, which is also the link turn argument for the decay. Racialization of the earth reduces land production and makes necessary the elimination of biodiversity, prompting a cycle of endless destruction. We can only solve through an anti-competitive disassembly away from the topic. Debate is labor that amalgamizes beings into the rhythm of a settler, and our movement against the assembly line shatters our forced adherence to our settlerism. All we need to win in order for a two-way R ballot is that settlerism is partially constituent of colonialism, which means that you would vote AF on the perm logically, because only the AF and the alt together can allow for the fluctuation needed between shattering the settlerism and for a necessary recognition of an understanding of land as an analytic, which lets us solve. The second impact is forced productivity. Our labor specifically is extracted through logistical capitalism by an a priori illusion of consent that centers on anti-blackness, humanism, and the subjugation of the oppressed in order to arrive at the capacity for generating modern capital. The central question of this debate in regards to this impact is whether or not the alt can solve, which if we win any risk of the cartographic coherence capacity DA, because of the Jazmyn minimal work in the 2NC against it, means that we win that out also as a net benefit to the worm, and it also proves a solvency deficit to the alt and their theory and understanding of things. At the end of the day, if Jazmyn wins particular things, i.e. the cumulative new knowledge is bad, but that the alt also fails to attune to productivity, it is still good for us to renegotiate our labor. That is a positive thing that the AF can do, which means that the perm would logically resolve it because their links mostly can read as links of omission. The AF is a performance of fugitivity from unintelligibility. This is rupture and destabilization of subjectivity that produces something new. We have no concrete end goal, telos, or specific relationality we want to generate because the inability to have a totalizing strategy is our point. Sovereignty manifests itself in updated contingent weights to maintain dominance. Our disengagement the evolving models of capture by owning our commitment to the white collective and instead moving against the assembly line. The undercommons is our new orientation, the way we learn to live in the world. Our very existence becomes communal in its unproductivity framework. Oops, you messed up by dropping the aspect of the flow. Letting us not specify the agents lets us spike out of virtually every link and means it gets a perm. First, it lets us also reduce down the scope of the links that Jazmyn generates based on letting the settlers in or settler moves to innocence by saying that centering specifically non-settlers, i.e. indigenous and black people within the undercommons, we can now make that claim because they have not held us accountable to forcing us agents. Big mistake, critique. I'm starting with the cartographic coherence capacity DA because it frames most of the rest of their links. Blackness status as flesh bars up from recognition and continuing of space-time. The genealogical isolation of blackness is not one of subjectivity in which cartographic coherence could be reclaimed, restoring the flesh to the body and blackness to landness. The unmappable nothingness of blackness forestalls any performance of sovereignty and instead to exhaust the paralontological reach of intersubjective relation, which is a prerequisite to both genocidal settler appropriation and the imaginaries of indigenous research. Beginning with the nothingness of the hold outside of space and time radicalizes their critique into a general antagonism with the world itself, which is a flaw in their critique that only the AF can solve, and none of their alt solves case accesses that specific in regards to black people and non-relationality to land. First, now onto the K line by line. First, the indigenous narrative is required to produce the AF. They can win that there's some necessary partial or taking or production of knowledge that is somewhat contingent on narratives, but A, this link is not impacted out, and B, even if they link this back to some sort of coloniality, it requires continued participation link. The second thing is that their framework is actually good for us. All of their arguments about how research doesn't spill out to material change and you let people, you invest in a project of innocence that makes people think that they're better off in this false wokeness. The problem is reducing the AF to a research project means that not only do we have to not worry about that, it's not a ballot for the neg because none of that disproves the project of research. Those are just generic flaws with research in the debate space, which also applies to the alt. AF being a project of research means reciprocally the neg has to logically negate that project of research. Negating a project of research does not line up to research doesn't spell out the space because obviously in order to negate that project of research, neg has to do the same thing, which means the links are non-unique. Nothing under their framework can generate links that let them go for knowledge production bad arguments, which is the huge fuck up they make. And any residual link you think they get is based on particular individuals being able to generate knowledge. At the very least, we generate knowledge that is outside of the normative scope of Enlightenment humanism, which if we win the cartographic coherence that gets us that access to good knowledge creation. And B, that knowledge creation also helps solve and bite back against this impact, which means the only thing that is able to actually resolve it is the perm, which fluctuates between how we understand our relationship to the land as well as the knowledge generated on it. Jazmyn's contextualization of how the alt produces knowledge means that production of knowledge is inevitable and proves my argument above about the framework about how the links will always be non-unique in regards to that. Ontology solves their explanation of fluid violence. Both structural and experiential violence require some explanatory theory to deviation from another particular section of violence, i.e. why do certain people experience this form of violence but not others? It's so their claims to violence aren't separate from the realm of paralogy because they have ontology or claims to personhood. You have to be sentient and have ontology, which links back, which proves their argument, which cuts back against their arguments about colonialism being a civilizing project because that project is undercut by the knowledge of the AF and our framing of paralontology. Necessary to operationalize sovereignty. Again, that's cut back by anti-blackness and blackness inability to have relation to sovereignty. None of the pedagogy mistake with self-actualization is a link that they can go for. And again, vote AF on the perm. It's not a debate because the AF is only a project of, research. No links us out of the settler innocence. It's not an intrinsic or severance perm because it's just a logical combination. And yeah, research combined with the alt solves everything.
Okay, I have 242 left. I'll start that whenever I set a timer. Okay, now I'll start it. Okay, that's time. The order is just gonna be the K page.
Awesome. Good whenever you are.
Okay, ready. Okay, I just gotta click back into my document and then set timer. Okay.
The K always in turn because violence under colonialism is no longer just the clearing of spaces, but the clearing of all spaces. We are winning the uniqueness question about the way that the white academy has sustained itself through transferring material conditions of violence into spaces like the university. Whiteness is the central way of understanding and interpreting the world, which means that engagement with the university only solidify material forms of the genocide, prioritize all critiques, settles and primal drive to produce dispossession in all spaces because indigenous people represent an opposing political reality. The same must be eradicated from it. I don't need to win my theory of ontology because the one year misses the central question in this debate. The ballot does not resolve a question of who best theorizes the world, but who best theorizes the way that the academy operates. Absent a coherent argument for any disruption of the university in the 1 year, it's an easy negative ballot. I'm going to do the link debate here. Any link that I win to the app is a linear distance to the case page and an independent reason to vote negative on presumption. I'm starting the Patterson link. It's a specific to the way that critical theories such as the affirmative in the academy's 6 pedagogies of self-actualization. They use arguments about mode and Hardy that has already been circulated within the academy and read by debaters with zero actual tells for creating any sort of new relationality. Even if they argue that they don't need to specify what it is, the fact of the matter is that once we hang up in the Zoom call, none of us are going to engage in the what I see as new form of relationality or study unless we're already doing so prior to the round, which means that they haven't won an answer to the question of how the app is able to train to relationships, a system of balance, or theorization of the way that the renegotiation of labor happens in the 1 year, maybe an easy pivot for the 2 year, but they haven't actually answered the way that this scholarship circulates throughout the academy. We've made a specific turn to the Ask Scholarship in the way that they are not a new university that's able to renegotiate these conditions of found to produce unnormative forms of scholarship, but in fact, they are the same university that they've critiqued to replace the settler knowledges within their forms of study. It becomes a second form of the university that obscures violence imposed by settler knowledges because they think that they're producing, quote, an unnormative form of knowledge. It becomes a tool of facilitating and justifying genocide, producing a settler pseudo study. The key issue here is that they've indicted the logistics as whiteness while actively participating in the same logics of whiteness within the university. Even if the 2 year tries to spin it and sit down on the fact that they're winning the way that logistics operates outside of the space, we've made an inherent argument for the academy and the way that for how the affirmative specifically has become a utopia that becomes imaginary, which settlers are able to radically imagine that personal knowledges are all special. That's a 2AC cross application of the individuation dissad and the way that the 1 year sits down in arguments like the link is non-unique, but our argument here is the way that critical theory and K-team specifically in debate think that they're producing something new, but instead they're just devaluing all sorts of knowledge, specifically indigenous ones. The impact here goes conceded. It seeks to eliminate out indigenous narratives while consuming their labor and able to produce their critique, but they've conceded the argument that you should just vote negative on presumption because scholarship can never repatriate land or liberate students, but instead it reuses settler technologies within the university that manifests itself through investments in debates, repetition, compulsion by their calls for the ballot, but they've considered a term impact of the case page. It turned any sort of materiality or exportability off into the 2 year trying to sit down on because it destroys the material organizing capacity. So even if they win, that they're able to produce a good form of relationality or renegotiate labor, it actually produces worse radicals who are less likely to engage in systems like the undercommons because they advocate for things like transfer of power with no way of actualizing that method or destroying the system, and instead are feeling satisfied at the end of the day without producing any sort of change. It disincentivize people who experience the 1AC from going out and taking actual material against the system that they've indicted, but they participate in the 1AC new form of study, which also gets their ability to produce a transformative power. I'm going for the nostalgia link. It's the only one that they have offense on. They go for an argument that the link is non-unique, but we've made an inherent argument about the way that the university argument, the link often the link turn about how the way that the app is able to generate unnormative knowledge doesn't answer the substance of our nostalgia link because the accumulation of knowledge can never actually disavow the system of logistics or the system of settlement. Even I lose the three power debate, it doesn't matter because this sort of narrative reconciles itself through nostalgia, that their own motin and harmony evidence in which they're able to imagine that they're able to produce some sort of world in debate or outside of debate where these systems of violence are no longer oppressing people. They're always nostalgic for the same sort of power that they've indicted, idealizing about a world in which this power may be challenged, knowing that the day will never come because of the way that white academia holds the monopoly over the university. The impact is settlerism, which goes conceded. It only allows settlers to distance itself from these conditioned developments, but it also produces a forced position of empathy in which Indigenous and Black people must feel guilt for settlers for their fear of their own demise. It results in the gaslighting of Indigenous people. I'm gonna answer the cartography dissent argument. They say that Blackness, or they say that the way that Blackness engages in subjectivity is not unmappable. I'll answer this argument with my ontology warrants from the QNC. We made an argument that settlement is a fluid structure in the way that it shifts take different form, but they've conceded that we control the proximate cause here because the way that they theorize Blackness in relationship to the logistic neglected nuances of the intersectionality of Blackness in relation to indigeneity. But even if they win this argument in the context of the Woods evidence, it doesn't matter because we're winning an inherent argument for why the university operates in the way that it was. That was the overview. But these systems of violence intersect, and even if they win that they have a better theory, they have no way of actualizing any sort of change, which is the critical theory link arguments from above. I'm gonna do the permutation debate here. First, I'm not going for the alternative, which mitigates any sort of offense that they made because we never made an argument that we produce a subjectivity shift, but that also means that the two are doesn't get to sit down on the permutation. But any sort of refusal of the affirmative knowledge, which we have indebted specifically a bad research project, should be a reason for negative. That's a link debate, but our Patelevin specifically set the stake for the debate here because the possession of land has been transferred to the ownership of knowledge, and the way that whiteness has become the only thing accepted in academia. It produces a narratives stolen from indigenous people to reproduce things like the logic of elimination, which in spaces like debate, which means that it produces self-preserving strategies against indigenous resistance. But if you can't answer the question of what restoring faith in debate and being able to renegotiate labor within spaces like debate can ever do to actually materialize action against conditioned violence outside of this round.
Right, 2 minutes. All right. It is going to be case then K.
Awesome. Good whenever you are.
All right. Logistics is the process of shipping reliant on financialization and privatization and the imposition of a settlerism onto both Black and Indigenous body politics. Its ultimate goal is ensuring the state and capital has maximum control over flows, i.e. energy, labor, goods, etc. So society's command over movement itself is a settler will to power that results in hyperproductivity and creating mechanisms to trap people in the cycle of work, reiterating master property ownership, which proves our link argument. Disrupting this logistic capitalism through knowledge production proves one primary that frame the two are some knowledge production from the periphery can be good because it can exist independently of enlightenment logics, which is that sustain the university, which means that it does not recreate the entirety of the university. Even if Jazmyn is right that this knowledge production has parasitic elements like its relation to land or how it requires indigenous or the high risk that the 2NR is winning that we do not translate into fully material action, it is still try or die relatively to move against the state because it locks everything in place as its logistics rests on the structural antagonism of anti-blackness. Logistics began with the shipping logic by the Atlantic slave trade, proving Moten's argument about blackness being parallel to logical comprising forces that call the nature of being into itself into question, proves the nature of black suffering is incomprehensible. No grammar that can articulate its being because blackness is an instrument in making of civil society, positioning the parallel to logical interplay of blackness and nothing this, i.e. black social life being impossible within the political, which means that only the AF can access social life, which is a net benefit to the AF. The solvency mechanism is choosing to move against the production line, is sabotaging it, subverting logistic capitalism, moving wrong and denying access to capital. The line never stops, so we just opt to utilize the undercommons to move against the direction of the line, not in opposition, but in refusal. We refusing completion and productivity, accepting we are incomplete and need not abstain from care for ourselves because of this incompletion. We undo the work of the line and refuse the productivity legislative attempts to impose and refuse on the system. While the alt ignores that the apparatuses of control diffuse the state as the regulatory center of control, our process of sabotage as praxis and education both literally solves the harms by disrupting the flows that render colonialism materially possible. We also scramble the terrain of the political within intellectual projects, which weakens the conclusion of the disciplinary subject and the population of control, meaning that all AF solves the case. Big problem with the 2NR1, can't tell whether they take the alt or not, so we still get a perm for this reason primarily. The neg without an alt would logically devolve down into a critique of us not spilling into material action and their sort of settler innocence knowledge materialization. Like those are omissions in the sense that they isolate things that we don't do. Those are not impacts that we actively reinforce, which is a huge distinction. Any permutation understands how we relate to the land and settlerism vis-a-vis indigenous and black relationality interacting, which means only an AF ballot holds any chance at pushing back against colonialism too. 2NR drops settlerism being a constituent part of colonialism. Yes, they've isolated parts where we may miss the boat in regards to theorizing colonialism, or rather how we theorize the academy. But the academy is partially comprised by this settlerism, which is what I did on case in the 1AR and now the case overview. If we win that settlerism is a necessary component of how the university operates, maybe we don't dismantle the university or able to materialize as Jazmyn has it. Would idealize it, but we are able to disrupt knowledge production within the university, which means that you cannot vote neg on, well, knowledge production, the AF mimics knowledge production in the university, because we engage against enlightenment projects of knowledge, which means that our AF produces knowledge that helps indigenous and black people resist and social life. That is good. The alt does nothing for that. That is an actual material impact, regardless of whether us in this knowledge go out of the ground and engage in this project or not. It is a hypothetically good thing to do, and I've proven the burden that this research is capable of doing that, which means regardless of whether they win a materiality or exportability takeout, we correctly theorize power. We correctly create a strategy that allows us to move back and push back against settlerism. That meets the threshold for an AF ballot. And third, no pushback on our A-spec kick out of the links. Again, there wasn't much work done in this, and I know that this isn't a huge part to say, but it at least provides us with some solid defense against their sort of settler recognition. And it means that we should get a perm because, again, they can't make arguments like white academia holds the monopoly over the university without admitting that the way that white academia holds the monopoly over the university is through logics and knowledge production that white academia has normalized. We move against that because they're part of the settler rhythm that we help dismantle. Renegotiating of the labor is a fundamental good. Our answer to this is, how does scholarship circulate in the academy? Again, scholarship circulates in the academy through settlerism that imposes productivity. One thing that you cannot deny is materially, the academy attempts to produce as much research that supports normative white systems and settler systems of knowledge as possible. Any move against that is a good move, and the neg has presented none, which means the links cannot be linear disads. There is no self-actualization link because, again, we are not arguing for the materialization of stuff. That is something that we have turned. And even if you do not buy the turn, you're winning defense against our ability to solve our impact. Essentially, the 2NR's impact that it went for is the lack of doing material things and settlerism distancing, right? Even if those are impacts, the AF impacts of settlerism outweighs the particular settlerism distancing, right? So for example, in the world where settlers are able to distance themselves from the violence that is happening and lets them create this fake wokeness that she expounded on in Crossix, A, non-unique because it's already happening, re our theory, and B, only our AF allows Black and Indigenous people to hold them accountable better by recognizing the tactics that settlers use to maintain settlerism. Again, we win on the perm. Yeah, we win on the perm reconciling this. I don't need the cartography DA because, again, they conceded that Blackness has a different relation to indigeneity, which is all I need to win. Read the case overview. We do not reproduce their code out. Good debate.
Yeah, good debate.
Yay, debate. So I think we're doing decisions for these, so I'm going to take a couple minutes to do it, and then I have RFD and comments and stuff. But you all can like get a drink, stand up, all that stuff. Oh, Jazmyn actually wants us to end recordings before RFDs. So thank you everyone for joining us for this recording. It was awesome. Hope you enjoyed seeing these two wonderful debaters duke it out. And we'll see you in the future for more stuff.